one of my core convictions when it comes to reading the story of Jesus in the gospel is that it is a radically subversive, revolutionary text. Jesus is always upending our expectations about what makes for a good and meaningful life. Saving for retirement? Store up your treasures in heaven. Want to go to your grandma's funeral? Let the dead bury the dead. Think that sinful people should get what's coming to them? Let the one without sin cast the first stone. Among all the places where Jesus messes with our expectations the most is when he's talking about work. So let's look at today's gospel, a familiar story, but think of it from maybe Peter's perspective. Jesus shows up at Simon's place of work after a terrible all-nighter. And then he gives him unsolicited advice on how to do his job when Jesus is a teacher and a carpenter and not a generational fisherman like Simon or his friends. And then to make matters worse, Jesus is right about how Simon should change his fishing tactics, leading to a haul of fish that nearly breaks the boat and probably would have ended up creating more work than they could have possibly done processing all this fish in that short amount of time. So can you imagine how galling this would be if you were Peter? It is no wonder that the story ends with Peter putting down his nets and quitting his job and doing something else. So I have a really complicated relationship with work. And when I was a child, one of the greatest compliments that I could ever have been called was a hard worker. And I think I got this because this kind of commitment to hard work, was something that was modeled for me by my father. Dad would work extraordinary hours. He'd rise before 5 a.m., he'd assign tasks on the farm, he'd meet with clients over coffee in town, he'd spend his mornings managing the John Deere dealership before heading home to take a shower and go to evening meetings in town. Family vacations were really rare, and even when we'd have them, he'd be on the phone like 2 or 3 times a day, checking in at the office or on the farm. When cancer eventually took my dad, he continued to work until entering hospice. And the last time that I saw him, just a month before he died, just 2 weeks before entering hospice, he was standing behind his desk at the insurance business that he was running. Work wasn't just something that he did. Work was for my father who he was. And it was fueled by a belief that this kind of unending commitment to effort was not only necessary, but somehow virtuous. But was it? The more I reflect on this, the more I think that such a view of work is not so much a virtue, but a mirror of our broader culture's addiction to productivity. Sociologist Cassandra Vaughan captures this perfectly. She notes that 1/3 of our lives will be spent at work, some 90,000 hours. And yet, in a recent survey, 80% of workers hate their jobs. Vaughan asked this question then: are you happy with the one place that you're spending the most of your life? Our response to dissatisfaction with work is often to buy into the illusion that if we just work a little harder, put in a few more hours, maybe pretend to love our jobs enough, it'll all be worth it. But is that true? I think Scripture suggests something otherwise. Peter's encounter with Jesus in Luke 5 begins with the same weariness that so many of us know. Master, we've worked all night and caught nothing. Like Peter, we often toil without results. But Jesus' response isn't to push Peter to work harder. It's to invite him to trust and to let go. The gospel offers a radical reorientation to our relationship with work. It suggests that flourishing doesn't come from more striving, but from resting in God's provision. So this is where we begin today, by asking what happens when we, like Peter, let go of our nets and trust that God can fill them in ways that we could never imagine. So the story that we read this morning in the gospel is part of this broader section in Luke that describes Jesus' early ministry in Galilee, and it begins in Luke 4 and goes all the way to Luke 9. It's a period marked by growth and by teaching and by healing, and then here in chapter 5, the calling of the disciples. The scene opens with Jesus teaching from Simon Peter's boat, which sounds a little strange when you first hear it, but actually it made a lot of practical sense at the time. In that place, the northern coves of the Sea of Galilee are like these natural amphitheaters with high banks going down to the flat water below. And you can imagine the banks of these little inlets being like the seats of an amphitheater, and the boat and the sea below being kind of like a stage with Jesus as the main character, giving him an opportunity to speak and be heard in this scene where so many people are pressing in on him, signaling something about the incredible growth of influence that Jesus is having here at this stage in his ministry. Luke then places the call of the disciples at this point in the story, which is different from how Matthew and Mark place the call. For Matthew and Mark, Jesus is walking along and sort of picks up at Peter and Andrew and John and is like, hey guys, come follow me. But here, it's almost expected that these early disciples knew something about Jesus. This is perhaps a way for Luke to emphasize that Jesus was a known figure to Peter, James, and John. Maybe they had witnessed or even heard some of the authority and the miracles that we see from Jesus' ministry. And so this miraculous catch of fish becomes an affirmation to them of Jesus' divine power. These fishermen are not merely responding to a preacher of some approaching kingdom. They see in Jesus one who reveals an immediate and compelling encounter with the living God. The story here then concludes with a radical act of surrender. They left everything and followed him. Luke emphasizes that discipleship is a life-altering commitment. It's not just an abandonment of one's livelihood, but an embrace of a new vocation that's grounded in trust. Through this call story, Luke invites the reader, us, to reflect on our own response to God's call, not as an isolated act of faith, but as part of a larger mission of God, where our obedience meets God's abundance. Simon Peter's encounter with Jesus on the Sea of Galilee wasn't just a call to leave behind fishing. It was an invitation to a new way of trusting in God's provision. And like Peter, many of us labor under the weight of work and its many demands. We strive, pulling empty nets from the sea, often feeling as though no matter how much effort we exert, the return is never enough. Yet this story isn't about the value of hard work. It's about what happens when we stop relying solely on our efforts and instead trust that God has our backs, that God is with us. I've personally learned something of this lesson kind of the hard way. A few years ago, I accepted a call as the acting president at the seminary down the street, and I was driven by a sense of mission, and to be honest, maybe a little overconfidence in my own ability to fix things. And so I threw myself into this task, and I worked tirelessly to try to stabilize the seminary. And while some of these efforts bore fruit, they came at an immense personal cost. And I vividly remember many nights feeling physically and emotionally spent, plopping my head on Julia's lap and just weeping, thinking, why did I accept this job? Like Peter, I had reached the end of my capacity, casting my nets without feeling like I had much to show for it. And that's where God's grace met me, and where I believe that God's grace can meet all of us. Yeah, the seminary is doing better today, but the success depended less on my striving than I want to admit. In fact, it was really only after stepping back from leadership and letting go of the illusion that I could fix everything that I could really truly see God's abundance and also my own limits. So Peter's response to Jesus, "At your word will I lay down my nets," it's not an act of perfect faith, but a decision to trust in something beyond Peter's own effort. And the result wasn't just this full catch of fish. It was an invitation to a new way of life. Don't be afraid, Jesus tells him. From now on, you'll be catching people. Leaving the nets behind wasn't simply about abandoning work. It was about embracing a life shaped by trust in God. For many of us, this idea of surrender is kind of terrifying. Our culture continually tells us that success is tied to productivity, and our worth is measured by what we achieve. But Jesus offers us a very different vision, a life of abundance that's rooted not in output, but in grace. And so in a world obsessed with outcomes, Jesus calls us to step back, to trust and rest in the reality that God's provision can be more than enough. So the question for us today is this: what nets do we need to leave behind to fully experience this sense of God's provision? How can we reclaim a joy in working, not to achieve, but to participate in God's abundant creation? In our current political climate, there is an overwhelming emphasis on efficiency and productivity and financial gain. Even national priorities are shaped by this relentless drive to do more with less, often at the expense of compassion and justice and care for human dignity. The dismantling of global aid programs like USAID is part of a broader cultural narrative, one that reduces human flourishing to success, productivity, and efficiency. But in a world obsessed with efficiency, Jesus invites us into something countercultural. Peter's call to leave behind the nets wasn't just a personal invitation, it was a challenge to reimagine a life beyond striving. It was a call to let grace lead and to trust that God's abundance is enough. Like my father at his desk, we sometimes hold on to a belief that our worth is tied to what we produce. But in God's economy, it's our surrender, not our striving, that leads us to abundance. So here's a question that I want to leave with us today. What nets do we need to release in order to make room for God's abundance? What would it look like to trust grace and not effort as the path towards true flourishing? So this week, let's consider one area of our lives where we might feel trapped by striving. Maybe it's at work, where we feel like we've never done enough. Maybe it's at home, where we feel like perfectionism leaves us feeling exhausted. Or maybe it's in our spiritual lives, where we feel like we're constantly trying to earn God's love. Let's take this week one practical step towards surrender. Maybe it's leaving work an hour early. Maybe it's giving ourselves permission to rest. Or maybe it's just praying the simple sentence, God, help me to release my nets and trust in your abundance. When Peter let go of his nets, they filled in ways that he could never have imagined. God's abundance didn't depend on Peter's effort, and neither does it depend on ours. It depends on grace, a grace that overflows with joy and peace and freedom, waiting for us to receive it. So let's let go. Let's trust that God, who fills empty nets, can also fill our lives with everything that we truly need. Amen.